actually creates, a flow and a structure and a line, and it looks like a whole bunch of just scribbles, and that's totally fine because what we're going to do is we're going to come down here and we're going to make that lighter, add one more layer, and now we can follow that structure that we just created to give us a really good idea of perimeter outline. And we can always go through and make, add little bumps and nuances and stuff like that. For the elbow bone, maybe we'll bring that out a little bit more like that. Once again, we'll have that line on the inside of the bicep just to kind of show where things are going. This area coming up here is going to be part of the armpit. Maybe we'll bring some of this back and show kind of where it attaches to the body. Not that a whole lot of that's going to get a lot of focus, but sometimes it's nice to have that. Oh, we got the YouTube back up. Hey, welcome everyone. Now, I always like to give the upper portion of the forearm on a dragon. I always like to give that a little bit more of a character, a little bit more of almost like a jagged line. It's just something I enjoy doing. And then I'll keep like the underside of it pretty much straight, minus where like I think it's going to wrap around a little bit. I just think it gives it a little bit more character. Once again, for these thumbs, we're going to come back here to our volume sketching layer. And we're just going to make these kind of light. Then we'll just add a fingernail there. Smooth out the edges, show where it connects to the hand. By using the volume sketching technique, it's going to allow us to go through and build up the volume of this. Well, right now I'm working on a finger, but by varying the size of our ovals and our circles, we can actually go through and make certain parts bigger or smaller. And that's going to help us in the long run by being able to go through and create different types of like notches and bumps, because that's going to make it a more unique shape. Same thing over here. Tighter. And then bigger for the knuckle, and then tighter again. And then much bigger for the tip of the finger. It's going to make for a more interesting shape. For the thumbs are kind of weird and kind of tricky. I'm all thumbs. Like, yeah, I don't know. Just weird. So hopefully we get someone else that joins us today. If not, you guys are stuck with me for about an hour listening to me rant and rave and talk. Hopefully you don't mind that. If you do, well, sorry. Usually I've got at least one other person in here with me, but sometimes people get busy and life gets busy and nothing we can really do about that. Let's see here. This is going to be coming down. Okay, that'll work for that. And then what we'll do is we'll just bring this over. This is where we want to show the connection between these two guys. Give it a little bit of a palm. This. Now, I've noticed that there's usually a couple of different ways that people will draw dragon fingers. There's a couple of different ways that I notice people draw finger waves too. The one way is to keep either the bottom portion smooth and give the top portion some bumps and ripples, or you can give the bottom portion some bumps and ripples and then keep the top portion smooth. And I'll kind of go through what each one of those looks like. So if I was going to keep the bottom portion smooth, I would literally just do like a pretty smooth line, and then here up at the top, I would kind of give this a texture and give this a little bit more of like a weird shape. I'll cut this back a little bit for the fingernail that I want to have in there. Maybe give this a bit more of a sharpened point. So that's one way we could do it, and that could work well. Because everywhere that there's like a little dip, we can just make like a little dragon scale kind of texture thing. Right, so that's one option. And then we would kind of loop those off, and then that could be cool. Our other option, if we go through and we remove all of this, is to go through and give this, some bumps and some texture. And then this, we would just kind of keep it pretty smooth and pretty straight. So these are, like I said, these are kind of the differences that I've seen with people whenever they draw like dragon claws and fingers and stuff like that. Um, it's just something that I've observed over the years. Whenever I sat down and I analyzed this stuff to try to figure out how people draw these kinds of things. Um, by all means, you don't have to follow that, but it is kind of nice visually to be able to go through and like keep one part more simple to make it easier to read and understand. And then you can make the other part more complex where you want a bit more texture and you really want to kind of show off some of your texture and some of your kind of angular curves. You know, I usually try to tell people right off the bat that if they're going to do smooth at the top, keep it consistent with every finger. Otherwise things can just get to be a little too confusing. Then the palm's going to need a little bit of an adjustment here. So for the palm, we'll bring this down. Over here for this finger, give that a little bit of a, almost like a little bit of a webbing. Over here for the thumb, we'll give this a little bit of a webbing. Now we've got a dragon's claw. And we can make the forearm a little bit fatter if we want to, give it a little bit more muscle. Maybe give the elbow a little bit more of like a bony look. Work. So now we've got one dragon hand and arm. Now let's go and do the other one. The other one, I'm going to kind of bring this guy down just like I did on the last one. Bring the bicep down, give him some big beefy arms. Now, as I mentioned before, part of this area is going to be hidden by the curvature of the body. So a lot of this is going to be kind of tucked back. And I may even go through and end up silhouetting some of this or some of the body back here. So I'm not really super concerned about that. I haven't gotten that far yet. Give this like a little wrist bone. But we did want to make this a little bit more bumpy, just to give it a bit more character. Cool. And then once again, we're going to go through and use some volume sketching. Kind of figure out some of these angles and where this thumb is going to be. Tighter here, bigger at the knuckle, tighter again, and bigger at the tip of the finger. Knuckle there. Same thing over here. Tighter. Bigger by knuckle. Tighter. And then bigger by the tip. I probably should have drawn that part on a separate layer. So let's do that. Copy and paste. Hide. Erase. Lower. Now that I've got my volume sketching out there, I can go through and start kind of. I know for this one, we've got a pretty smooth top. So we'll go through and we'll make this kind of smoothish. Show where that connects to the wrist. Bring that around since we already know where our thumbnail is going to be. Maybe we'll give that guy a bit of texture too. I'm going to follow this. We're going to give a couple little like directional lines to show where the joint is and where the bend is. It's going to be the underside. Then we're going to keep this top portion kind of smooth. Maybe a little bit of an inflection by where some of these joints are going to be. And then fingernail. And everyone's got their own little method and their own little twists to things. Some people like to give the nails of dragons these kind of like little bumps right down here where they connect. And that works. That's one way to help kind of thin out a fingernail for a dragon. Only I would probably say, let's do that a little smooth. This down. And if we don't like it, we can always erase it and do it again. It's that easy. Maybe I won't make this part quite as big. And now I've got a little bit more room to play with the fingernail. Maybe I'll have it, give it a little bit of a softer angle. There's another dragon fingernail. I must have these two hands done. Since we made the tip of this one a bit smaller, I'm going to do the same thing. And over here, make this guy a little bit smaller. Under here. I've got a little bump. Just give it some like texture. This dragon nail is going to be coming down. Probably only going to see a portion of it. Cool. And then over here, we're going to want to show where these things connect, where these two fingers connect. So we want to do like a little kind of shadow. Just kind of shade it in, shade as you go, create those volumes and that shadow. So that way you know where your light's coming from and what parts are separate from what parts. And if you don't like it, save the layers, hide them, and you can always move on and do it again. Lord knows I've done like 4 sets of dragon hands and claws so far. Just trying to get an idea for which ones I really like the most. So that's one set. Here's another set that I was playing around with. I think I've got another set in here somewhere. But that's kind of what I do. You play around with it a little bit and figure out which ones you like and which ones you don't like. And, I like the way that in this one, if I'm looking at it and I really want to emphasize the fact that the head is moving in this direction, well, if I have a hand moving in that direction too, regardless of how these fingernails kind of curl back, it's going to work because I've got parallel line with the underbelly of the jaw. I've got a pretty similar angle coming down here with this hand, so that's going to work well. So I've got a lot of these diagonals that are moving your eye up in this direction. Well, these two are moving it up. This one's moving it down, but in the same kind of diagonal direction. The whole time coming down from the body, I've got like a cross flow going along with this area here. I've got a kind of similar angle coming down here in this direction that's going against the natural flow of the forearms and the fingers and the head. So that's going to create a natural sense of depth. And it's crazy the way that stuff works, right? Because you don't even really have to try. As long as you have those two aspects, it's going to create the sense of movement. Wherever you have like intersecting diagonals, it creates a sense of movement. Before the show today, I just went through and was playing around with some ideas for legs, dragon legs. I don't know if I'm necessarily going to include those or not. I really would prefer not to, but I almost kind of think it needs it. So I am going to go through and like sketch with this stuff a little bit more just to take a look at placement. Because I can do, if I do hip here, because you want to make sure that they're on a parallel kind of look in accordance with the position of the body. So that would actually be off a little bit. So take your body, right? Your dragon's body, or whatever it is you're drawing. Find where that center line is. So if here's, right along 3/4 of it, and then I've got this guy coming down over here. This is my center line. I'm going to want to make sure that everything stays. If I know that that body is at that kind of an angle, right, based on where this center line is and how this center line is moving, then that's going to tell me that I need one hip here and one hip's going to be over here. Right? That's going to be a lot more accurate. If I was going to put the hips of the dragon here, right, then my center line would actually be more here-ish. Right? And if that's my center line, then that means I'm going to have one hip here and one hip pretty much hidden over here. But to me, that's almost like too close to the hands. So I would want to move it a bit further away. That's kind of why I was debating and playing around with like the rest of the tail section. It's, again, I don't know if I'm going to include it or not, but if I do add it, then technically speaking, I could probably get away with moving these back a bit more, maybe doing like, once again, here's my center line. Here's my cross section of it. Now I've got my center line here, so that's going to tell me a lot more. This is going to be visible than over here. We can actually hide these hands for a second. So if I was going to draw these hips, I actually draw my hips a little bit differently. I'll start off with like the actual hip area. And then I'll say, okay, where, if this was, say, if you look at a dog's leg or a deer's leg, or hey, Nate, how's it going? Just saw you popped up in the YouTube. Look at the way they're constructed. They've kind of got like this weird kind of angular thing going on with them. Go through and take it back a step or two so you can actually see what I'm doing. Okay, so I've got, these are my two hip areas. Clear that. So as far as like the way that I would construct a dragon's hind leg, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. If I wanted to have the dragon's leg more or less straight, I would start out with something here, give this a bit of a bump. Bring this down, and then this would act almost like his knee area. And then I could drag this down and off to the side. Right. And then they would have more or less like an ankle area, and toes would come down that way. So we could do here to here to here. Like dragon toe, dragon toe, dragon toe. Right, but then that would be going off the page. So I'd probably opt to have them more bent just to conserve space. I do like the idea of having them come down a bit more though. But I think I might kick it back a little bit at the knee and then shoot that forward a bit more. From here, I would take it up and over, here and down. Then you could have almost like that one. Imagine this is coming towards you a bit more. This would be coming towards you a bit more, and this would be coming towards you a bit more. So you would see a lot more of like the palm of the dragon's foot here. Um, if I wanted that to go in that kind of a way. Probably bring this down, give this a big knee, bring this back, give this a little bit of like that ankle joint. Just do some light volume sketching just to make sure that everything's going to look all right. So that could work. This would come up here. This ankle joint would stay more towards the back. Your knee would be here. Maybe bringing that down. I mean, that could work pretty well. But then you run into issues of like, okay, well, if there's that one, where's the other leg? That's why sometimes you'll see people that'll go through and maybe they'll just have like, like little fingers like popping out here and there, just kind of giving you the idea that, most of this leg is hidden, which can work. That can work really, really well sometimes. I'm a very much sensical person, so I may go through and actually say, okay, well, if this is this, then let's bring this down, even though they won't be able to see most of it. At least I'll know that the anatomy is correct, and I'll know that there's a hint of that there, right? This center line would come back and over. I'm one of the, I don't know. There's something about people taking shortcuts to make things easier to draw and stuff like that. I'm just not a big fan of it. If you're going to draw a dragon, draw a dragon. Don't put, like a whole bunch of different negative space there just so you don't have to draw skeletons. So how do you select the flow of the lines of the body? That's a good question. So that takes a lot of playing around with, and it all kind of depends on where you want to put the dragon and what kind of a look you want to give it, right? I'll start from scratch and just kind of do it again just to be amusing for today. Let's go with a different color. Let's go with orange will work. So for the body, well, first thing I want to do before I do anything else is I want to sit down and figure out where the head goes, right? Where do I want the head? If I want the head flying up, that's going to be one way. That's going to kind of determine how I want the body to flow there. If I go through and say I want the head facing down in this direction, almost mid-page, right? That's going to make my body flow in a very, very different way, right? Because if I wanted the head to be almost middle of the page or middle of the area, which I don't usually recommend. Um, just because visually it's not the best. I always like to go, if you were to lay like a rule of thirds off of this, you know, dividing everything into like thirds, so that would give you 9 squares. Obviously, this is not accurate, but you get the idea, you get the gist. I always like to try to focus on, like one of these 4 areas for the head, depending on the area of the body that it's going on, and depending on what direction the client wants it to be flying. So that's why, if I'm drawing and flying up that way, or maybe it's flying up that way, or maybe it's flying down, I want it to come down from this upper corner. That way I've got plenty of room for the body. Um, but I try to avoid putting the head like right in the middle of the page. That's just personal preference. Visually speaking, it's going to be a lot more interesting if it's offset to one of the corners. So that's just some food for thought. But let's say that we want to have dragon's head. We'll go with almost like more of a classic dragon head down this way. Eyes. Bit of a mustache. Now, the dragon I was drawing before had a very, very calm look. We can give this guy a bit more of an attitude. Parallel. So the angle that which you have the dragon's head to begin with, that's going to ultimately determine the way that the body and the direction of the body is going to move from that point. I always like the dragon's head to be the focal point. But that's up to you. If you wanted, say, one of the dragon's arms to be the focal point, you can do that. But that's, it's more of a personal preference thing. Maybe you want them holding a ball of light, you want to direct most of the attention there. That's totally fine. You can do that absolutely without a hesitation, without a question. It's just going to give you a different priority, right? So if I had the dragon's head up like that, I would create a new layer. Now, I really like to use either the snake kit from Tattoo Smart or the serpent kit, or the snakes brush set. I forget where I think I got some of those guys. But there's one that I found, it's called Supreme Serpent. And I like it just because it gives it a little bit of value, like a little bit of, shading and whatnot. So it's easier to follow along. So if I wanted to go through and do a dragon body flowing with this, first thing I would do is mark out what direction this head is moving and what direction I want the dragon to be moving in, because that's going to tell me a lot about where everything is going to end up going. So I know that if I've got the dragon's head moving in this direction, right? I'm going to take my snake brush set. Um, that one didn't turn out so well, so we'll undo it. It could be cool if you wanted to do like an upper half. Um, you know, Ideally, if you've got the head moving in this direction, you would want the body to come up and then cross that, right? Once again, creating a sense of depth. Um, so come up, come up, cross it, come back around, and then go back down following that line. What that's going to do is that's going to force people, it's going to force you to have this angle. This angle is going to create your depth. This angle is going to bring your eye up and around, right? So you've got everything going on, right? So you've got starting here, coming down, bringing it around, bringing it up and over. It almost creates what Guy talks about in his book called the three-dimensional figure eight, which creates a visual sense of depth and flow. So I always try to incorporate some of that into what I do because it just makes for a more visually interesting design. Um, the only thing we're missing is something coming down around in this area, but we've got an implied line if we move part of this body here, right? That's going to force the eye to complete the rest of this, right? Implied line is an absolutely awesome thing, and there are certain artists out there that are masters of using what a factor called implication, right? They're implying that something is there, but might not actually be there. It's a fascinating little resource where you can kind of trick people's minds into looking at things and seeing things that might not actually be included. Like think of like a triangle, right? That's just broken up into like three separate V points, right? Two at the bottom, one at the top, right? But they're all separate V's, nothing connecting them. Your mind is going to go through and automatically connect those, but there's no actual connecting line, right? Because it's implied, right? Your mind is going to create it. So sometimes I'll play around with that kind of a concept. Sometimes I'll go through, and I'll add a little bit of maybe I'll add like a little bit of background flow or negative space to it, not necessarily because I'm trying to block out areas that I'm not trying to tattoo or to make things easier or anything like that, but more or less just to continuously move your eye around and bring your eye all the way back up to where I want you to look, which is right here. Right. So by having all of these different visual kind of tools, you can force people to look wherever you want them to look. If you want them, yeah, that's probably a better angle for the dragon's head. So I would still say I would probably still move it back over that. So yeah, I always try, if I've got the head moving in this direction, if I've got the head moving in this direction, I want to bring the body up, down, cross, back around, and following that same direction of the head. It's just going to create a more visually interesting piece. And in throughout the whole thing, um, oh yeah, man, I'm a big art theory nerd. Like I could talk about this kind of stuff literally for hours, and I have before. It's something I will never stop learning about because there's so much of it out there, and like little tricks and little keys and little like nuances that you can add that just completely change the game, you know but yeah, I'm a big advocate of getting people to look where you want them to look, and everything else in that piece is driving you towards that one spot, you know. And you see that a lot with master oil painters from the Renaissance. You see that a lot with the great tattoo artists of today. They want you to look at one specific thing, and they use all of the tricks in the book to force you to look at that one specific thing, because that's where they want your attention to be. Um, so I try to capitalize on that, and I try to make sure everything that I do is in some way, shape, or form centered around that. For let's go through and just take a look and see what I've got here. This is, yeah, this part get partially erased, because I would want that to flow back up and around. Now, if this doesn't follow what I was just talking about, there's a pretty good chance I'll go back through and completely redraw everything. And I'm not opposed to doing that, because I've already redrawn this dragon like 4 times. Yeah, I know. I spend a lot of time drawing and redrawing things, but I'd rather have it look right. That's what so there's a pretty good chance that as I work on this more and more continually, I'm probably going to scrap it at some point and be like, you know what? Not exactly. In fact, this, like I said, this is like the 3rd or 4th one I've drawn. Started out with this one, and this is what you're seeing now is like the 2nd version. Started out with this one with like the hand kind of open towards you, but I didn't really kind of like the way that the body was going or the head direction. I like this one a little bit more refined, a little bit less of a body up at the top. But once again, this is a perfect example of, if you look at the depth, I've got that crossing here, right? Coming back down, almost in like a Z pattern up, and then I would bring that back down again. So it would still be following that same kind of pattern. Where you would have the angle of the head, this portion of the body, this portion of the body. You could even you could use the arms as counterflow to come across here, right? This one could come up and then down in this direction. And then that could cross as well. That could work well for creating more depth and dimension. Look at basic shapes and basic angles. But if you look at where the head is positioned, as I was talking about before, here, this eye, look at where that sits in regards to the canvas itself. Yeah, pretty awesome, right? So yeah, I still have some more playing I'm gonna do with these guys. It's just the thing that really bothered me about this one, and it's something that I can't unsee, is if you look at basic anatomy and whatnot, this horn here comes over top of the body, which makes sense. That's perfectly fine. But if this dragon were like an actual thing and you wanted it to actually make sense, then technically speaking, this horn would be stabbing the body over here, right? It would be stabbing itself, So this doesn't necessarily go with the actual perspective, because if you were to draw a straight line across, here's our midline for the dragon's head, draw your straight line across. This antler or dragon horn would actually be here, because it would be following in a very similar line to this guy, and it would be stabbing straight into the body. Coworker pointed that out, and now I can't unsee it, so I decided to start from scratch. Thanks, by the way, to my coworker that pointed that out. Yeah, you're making me put in an absurd amount of time more, but it's okay. Yeah, so I'm still figuring out what I want to do with the legs. I think the legs might be a bit big. So I may go through and where are this is the problem. I have too many layers. Don't nah, I'm just never. That's why I draw very, very small. This canvas is only the way I have this canvas set up is that it's only, I think, 7 inches tall by 4 inches wide, and it's at 300 DPI. So I can have like 1,000 different layers on it. It's great. I could rotate the hips, maybe have the hips pointing down a bit more if I really wanted to. I could rotate them back and move them forward a bit more. That could work well. And this is like a little trick, by the way, if you ever run into a problem where you need to find like a counterflow or you need to find a way to bring your eye up and continue those visual diagonal lines. This is an easy way to do it. If you draw everything on separate layers, you can always change the angle of things. It may involve going through and tweaking certain things, drawing a little bit more, or erasing certain parts of it, but you can always go through and adjust certain angles just by, rotating those layers. If I were to go with this, it's darker here. I would get rid of this part, maybe bring this, I would have to drop down a little bit lower. And then I'd still have to figure out what I want to do with this back leg. But once again, if we look, this thigh is going to be pretty similar angle to that, pretty similar angle to that, which is going to follow the under portion of the mouth and the jaw. So I've got plenty of angles there. And then we've got the body crossing in the back there, body crossing over here, body crossing over here. So I just need a little bit more visual angle, like coming down in this direction or in this direction to kind of visually balance everything. Otherwise, it's going to be a little bit weighted too heavily going in this direction. And that's not what I want people to look here, not over here. And anywhere where you have a lot more diagonal lines moving in one direction, it's going to naturally force people's eye to move in that direction over the direction you might. Oh, listen, D&D dragons and English fantasy dragons and wyverns and all that stuff. I mean, that's like that you can have a lot of fun with, especially with angles, because not only do you have angles of the legs and the hands, if you decide to give them, arms and hands as well as wings, but you've got these great, visually dynamic wing sets. If I wanted to turn this into like an English dragon or give it some wings, I could very easily throw these on here. And once again, paying attention to my angles with everything, maybe I'd give it like more of like a webbed bat wing. That in the background there, the wing on the other side. You probably wouldn't see too much of it. That would be in the background, but you can play around with these angles a lot more. And as long as you're careful about them, you can use these to your benefit. absolutely. Um, plus you've got, more straight, angular mouths and snouts. The snouts on English dragons that I draw are typically a lot sharper, and usually come to a bit more of like a point. As opposed to something a little bit softer and a bit more rounded. The jaws would be open a bit more. You'd have a bit more nasty, sharp, pointy teeth. Jaws can be squared off a bit more. I usually do like spikes on the eyes, like little horns jutting up here and there, maybe a line of horns coming up the middle of the head. I wouldn't necessarily do a big beard, but I might add some spikes, some like sharp, pointy spikes. So, but yeah, I would use the same basic concept if I was drawing like, a fantasy English dragon over an Asian style. Just because it's going to make things a bit more interesting, and it's going to make things flow with whatever part of the body you put it on a bit better. Obviously, if this was going to be more of like an English fantasy dragon, I'd give this guy a big old pot belly. Because they had, in my mind, they had big old pot bellies, from eating all the villagers and stuff like that. Plus they needed to have a bit more of a wider body so that they could lay on tops of mountains of gold a little bit better. Um, I see Asian. Uh, Good. I mean, you could say that they are, but I mean that's all in the way that they're drawn. As far as being fluid and graceful, I've seen some extremely regal, very graceful looking, like English and medieval dragons as well. Once again, it's all in kind of how you render them and how you want to portray them. Dragons, as far as I know, do not exist. Because they do not exist, we can draw them any way we want. If you want to draw an English dragon with big bat wings and a big old pot belly that's flying around, you can make it look super graceful. I think that there was a company that used to be out a long time ago called Alchemy. And they had this one dragon on a poster that was, extremely regal, very fluid, and very graceful. But once again, it depends on how you want to portray it. If it doesn't exist, who's to say that you're wrong? Right. But understanding flow of the body can definitely be helpful as far as establishing, how do you want it to be? Do you want it to be all bunched up and aggressive? Do you want it to be very drawn out and smooth and flowing? Do you want it to be, just kind of like, you know, short and there? Like, I don't know. You can make them however you want to make them. The question is, what do you want them to look like? If I have, I don't know if I would probably that a little bit. I was going to go with this kind of a placement. Something like that. As always, if anyone out there ever has any questions about anything I'm drawing or anything I'm talking about, or if you would like me to discuss in more depth and detail anything that I discuss on any of these shows, by all means, please go through. You should be able to see my Instagram in the upper right corner of the screen. Feel free to send me a direct message on Instagram. I'll be happy to talk your ear off about anything. Um, yeah, it's always nice to go through and hear from different people, if they like the show, if they don't like the show, if they're getting anything out of it. All I can do is make assumptions and pray that the things I'm talking about are going to be helpful to someone out there. Um, so, yeah, if you do find any of this information helpful or anything like that, by all means, please feel free to drop me a note. Let me know. That way I know that, people are actually watching this stuff. Uh, Yeah, so now that I've decided that I want to put this leg over here, now the question is, what do I do with the next leg? I mean, I could have the joint coming up. That's my midline, and that's my midline. Still technically have like fall, fall, fall. So I could just have like a couple of fingers poking out. Not that I don't want to have the rest of the leg, but I'm starting to very quickly run out of room. So it gets kind of tricky when it comes down to, if you want to have something a lot longer. I usually like to make the legs a little bit more straight, give them a little bit more of an angle. The problem is when you're working with a much smaller area, um, this client, it doesn't want to go super huge with anything. So it's kind of difficult to go through and be able to make a whole dragon with everything in there from scratch to be able to get it to kind of look the way that I want without sacrificing any detail in like the head. Um, don't get me wrong. When all is said and done, if this were to be like true to size, this head would be almost 8 inches wide, but at least half of that would be the horns. So if you look at the proportions there, now I'm looking at, okay, well, if the horns are, half of the head, half the length of the head, well, double the length of the head, maybe they're the same length. In this one, they're the same length. Different people draw them different. Um, and this is almost 8 inches. It's probably about 7. If I cut this in half here, well, now I'm looking at, so from roughly from there to here is 8 inches, right? This is only going to be like 3 inches long. So am I really going to be able to get these eyes in there to make them hold up over time? That's why I'm trying to go through and maximize everything to really get the emphasis where I want. That's why I don't know if I'm going to go with the head or go with the legs down here, because ideally I would like to have the dragon's head be a minimum of 4 inches. That way I know everything's going to hold up over time with tiny little details and stuff like that, because that's what I really want people to look at. I want them to look right at this eye right here. Right. And then everything else can kind of fall into place. Um, if the hands are there and they're rendered perfectly great, if they make sense, awesome, but essentially, as long as I've got people looking here, then anything down here, not necessarily going to be at the forefront of everything. I mean, for me, it's a personal thing. And yeah, I definitely want it to look the best it can from any angle and be to make sense and be anatomically, I guess, correct, even though there is no correct anatomy for a dragon. Why? Because they don't exist. Not that I have any proof to corroborate. So, um, but maybe we could just tuck like a little bit of the thigh back there. That could come back a little bit more and join the body back there a bit more. Which means that this portion would kind of come up here because we would this to move back a bit more. Now we get into scales, and scales are just a nightmare. I love drawing them because they're tedious. So we'll do a little bit of that before we got to go today. Let's draw that in. So I've got a little trick for scales, which anyone that's out there, by all means, feel free to try this out and use it. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to, but I find it kind of speeds everything up a little bit. Instead of going through and drawing like perfect grids all the way around and then bisecting them and creating like, individual little cells that are going to be filled with, small little curves, which does work and it is accurate and it is, a great way to do it. Don't get me wrong, it's always accurate and it always works. So by all means, feel free to use that as a fall off. And this is the method that I'm talking about. I'm not a big fan of this method. I think it takes way too long, even though, yes, it is always completely 100% accurate. I am just not a big fan of it. But essentially, the theory of the grid goes that if you draw a grid, right, and you like basically bisect it all the time with like all of these tiny little lines, depending on how big you want your scales to be. Essentially, what you would do is you would pick a place to start. Additional one. So I would want to go here, right? And bridging these two squares, right? This one would bridge these two squares. This one would bridge these two squares. This one would bridge these two squares, etc., all the way up. And then this way, for a fact, everything is going to be in line and everything like that is going to be copacetic. Power to you if you have the patience to do this. I don't like this method. Goodbye. Do you do all the scales or do you do patches that highlight then suggest the rest are there? I am a traditionalist. I will draw every scale on the dragon because I am a firm believer that you can do like, little patch of scales and that can work. And it does give you the impression that, there's scales everywhere and it cuts down on time and that's cool. To me, it doesn't have the same kind of grit and it doesn't have the same level of detail that drawing all of the scales does. And that's kind of why I came up with like a little shortcut method to draw scales. Nope, wrong direction. So this would come down here. I use what's known as the S-shaped grid. If you look at anything out there that has scales, fish, snakes, dragons, if you can find a real one, if you do, please be careful with it, capture it. They're rather skittish. And then call me and let me know because I would like to see it in person so that I can artistically study everything about it. Um, but I came across this method a few years back and it tends to work pretty well. I call it the diagonal grid method or some stuff like that. But every animal out there that actually has scales, including, believe it or not, this also works for feathers on birds as well. If you draw a diagonal grid, right, and then you cross that diagonal grid with other diagonal lines, it will give you a grid that you can follow to create scales. Now, it may require a little bit of tweaking and it may require a little bit of practice, but I can guarantee you it does work. And I know because I use it all the time. The trick is you have to use it and follow the natural curves of whatever area you're doing. If I was to go through and do these scales, let's do a different color. Let's do like a dark green. So I've now created this grid. Okay. I'm going to find here and I'm going to draw a curve. And then I'm going to round this one out and then I'm going to round this one out and then this one out, this one out, and then this out. Maybe bring that down a little bit more. That out, round. And it creates those naturally intersecting scales. Some of you might think this is like a shortcut and it's not going to be accurate and it's not going to work well. It is a shortcut. It can be accurate if you draw it right, and it will work well if you draw it. If you don't draw it right, it will never work well, and you're going to be up the creek, and you're probably going to drop back and use the other grid method that I just demonstrated because you know that that one works. More power to you. Hope it works for you. Like I said, it takes some time to get used to it. Once you get the hang of it, oh boy, does it make life easy. Boom, boom. Now, some people out there do like to use the patch method, and that does work well. It does create the implied idea of scales everywhere. My biggest problem that I've seen with using that method is that sometimes you'll get people in certain parts of the body and they'll just like throw like scales like randomly, right? You know, maybe they'll do like a couple more over here, but they won't ever be consistent in size. They won't ever follow the correct line of the body to which they should be flowing, you know? And then it's like, okay, well, what do you do in areas like a shoulder, right? You can map everything out and make sure that it's accurate and you can stop it. I usually only do scales like on the outer portions of certain parts of the dragon's arm. I might have a little peak down here and then like some more on the upper portion of the arm here, like in this general area, but I'm not going to go super nuts with it because if you look at the underbelly of a dragon, it's got a very different texture. So my thing is, if you do the patches, right, you still have to know the flow of that dragon's body because otherwise you may end up with like scales that look like this heading off in a completely wrong direction, you know? And it's like, well, if it's going to look wrong, why would you do it? So that's my only real gripe about that. You know, I'm just all about accuracy and trying to make sure that everything is accurate and everything makes sense. Scales flow in a specific direction. and they have to flow with the body. They're going to get bigger in certain parts. They're going to get smaller in certain parts. They're going to get closer together in certain parts, and there's no getting around it. That is kind of the way that they work. Towards the outer portion of the body where you have a bend, they're probably going to get a bit more spaced out. Except I didn't draw this part right. No, that's good. Good. Right. That works. That works. That works. That's going. Where that's going to be. That's going to come over, and then this one's going to come over. So by using this method, I know it's going to flow correctly, and that's all I really care about. Um, I once submitted a tattoo to the Drunk Critique, which I highly recommend everyone takes a watch at. It's absolutely hysterical just to watch a whole bunch of tattooers sit around and get hammered and talk about stuff. I think it's some of the most fun any of us could have. Even if you're sober and you don't drink, that's fine. Take a gander because it's hysterical. Um, like absolutely comical. But I submitted a snake tattoo that I did to get a Drunk Critique, and was basically told that I needed my scales were completely wrong, and that I needed to go back through and learn how to draw scales the right way. So I spent a bit more time learning how to draw scales, and actually really looking forward to the next Drunk Critique so that I can go through and submit a new snake tattoo, which has scales that are done correctly. But it's like, we have the tools to do it right. Why wouldn't we want to do it right? Unless it's like, walk in and you're trying to squeeze it in between appointments. And then it's like, okay, we're just going to do some implied scales here. But if you're going to do that, just go for a texture. Don't even go for like little sets of scales or anything like that. Just do like a bumpy texture with black dots and call it a day, because it's going to give it a rough look without having to do a whole bunch of scales. That didn't take that long. At least I don't. Took what, a couple minutes, and I just drew a whole bunch of scales on this thing that I'm pretty sure are going to flow in the right direction. Sometimes you will end up in a situation where the grid that you drew was a little bit off. Maybe it didn't have the right kind of angle to these little squares that you get. And that's where you can go through and you would basically start over with all of these red grids, and then you would draw it again using a little bit of a different angle. We'll show you what that would look like. So say this was off a bit, right? I would draw it again. Sometimes what I like to do, especially if I'm drawing snakes and I want to have a good back pattern down the center of the spine, I'll actually start off with like little X's or V's, depending on where I want center scales to be. Maybe I'll draw here. But I'm never drawing like a perfectly straight like X. It's always going to be curved a little bit. Right? Because you want it, like, dragons and snake bodies are not built in straight lines. So You always want them to curve a little bit, right? And then sometimes I'll just work off of that because I know that as long as everything follows my center line, everything's going to work out well. So now it's just a matter of drawing parallel lines to all of these. There's a parallel line there. Over arc. Maybe they're not parallel, close enough because they, as the body moves around, they are going to change angles. They are going to get bigger and they are going to get smaller. Some of them are going to be off a little bit, so you have to go back through and adjust some things, but that's if you really want to split hairs, and be super crazy accurate with everything, which once again, if you're going to do it right. The hard way is the easy way because you're going to learn more and it's going to look better. And it goes to show, like, who you are. How much time are you going to spend working on an individual design? People out there that are spending, six, seven, $900 or more on a tattoo by you. Are you just gonna like throw something together and call it a day and be like, oh well, this is my style. I don't really know how to draw this, but this is, you know, I'm just gonna call it my style and they're gonna have to like it. No, that's not the way things work. Not the way I was brought up in this. There are some people out there that use that cop out. That's fine. You go do you. I'm not gonna say that you're wrong for doing it, but the way that I was kind of brought up in art was that, ineptitude is not a style. As harsh as that may sound, just because you don't know how to do something doesn't mean that that's your style. I think some of these are going to be slightly wrong, so I'm going to do it again. Boop. That's a beautiful thing about Procreate. Boom. We've got this guy coming in here. That is going this way. Follow that same curve here. Follow that curve. Direction. Curve here. That curve here. We're going to this curve. And now we're going to be a lot more accurate and we're going to have everything line up with where it needs to line up. And we know that that's a center scale, that's a center scale, that's a center scale, this is a center scale, this is a center scale. So now we know that everything is perfectly in line and we've got our perfect grid to go through. And we can start fleshing out our individual scales. Boom, boom, boom. Basically, you take these grids and you just like round off the tips. And you get great scales. Also, FYI, anyone that is still watching, we will not have an episode next week. Next week, I will be on vacation. I will actually be out in Amsterdam. So if any of you are from Europe and you want to meet up or anything like that, not that I think any of you actually will, but if you do decide that you want to meet up or something, please, by all means, send me a message on Instagram and we'll see if we can make it happen. No promises, no guarantees, but you never know. Yep. So now we can see we've got our scales. They're all flowing in the correct direction. Boom. And then go through and shade them in if we want to shade them in. I like to keep my scales a little bit bigger than some people probably do, but that's only because if I'm going to draw every single individual scale on a dragon, I'm not going to draw small ones. Okay. But I can guarantee you they will all flow in the correct direction. So, yeah, hope this has been helpful, everyone. I'm actually going to be jumping off in just a minute. Hope everyone is doing well. As always, if anyone ever has any questions or anything like that that you would like to ask, maybe you've got an idea for another show. Maybe you've got an idea for something that you want me to talk about on the next show. By all means, send me a message. Let me know. I'll be happy to get back to you as soon as I can. Well, as soon as I get back from vacation, because starting tonight at midnight, that is exactly what I'm going to be doing. We'll be on vacation and will not be able to answer. So, that being said, send me a message. If I don't get back to you, well, I will when I get back. On that note, everyone, thank you for joining us today. Take care, be safe, keep your hands moving, keep drawing, keep trying different things and making sure that everything that you're trying is being productive. And yeah, feel free to send me a message if you have a question. Otherwise, I will see everyone and talk to everyone when I get back from my vacation. So there will not be a skill building Sunday next week. Thank you very much for your time today. As always, feel free to email management@reinventingthetattoo.com if you have any questions or you would like a critique. And make sure to hit that like and subscribe button down at the bottom of the screen if you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well and has a great day. Thank you very much. Take care and goodbye.